Hello, everyone. Today we are joined by Walt Wolfram, very accomplished professor. I'm very excited to be able to interview him. He was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 2013 he received the North Carolina Award, which is the highest honor that a citizen of North Carolina can be granted. And just to give you some more perspective, I've checked out his resume and it's 38 pages long. So, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, the first question, just an intro question. What is your job title?
Well, I'm actually the William C. Friday Distinguished University Professor for English Linguistics, which should take up the whole interview. I have a long title because I'm a distinguished professor, and I also have an endowed chair. So you know what an endowed chair is?
No.
Okay, an endowed chair is where they raise a certain sum of money, and as a professor, you can use the dividends from that money for discretionary projects that you want to do, and they also add part of that to your salary. So I get more salary than the regular professors, and I also get more important to me, since I make enough money actually, is the fact that I get funds. So I have $100,000 a year to use as I want to use. So I can hire research associates. I can invest in production of documentaries and so forth, so I can do what I want with it.
And how long have you had that?
32 years. So I was the first distinguished professor in the College of in Chas, the College of Arts and what is it? Social Sciences. Yeah.
So, how long have you been teaching at NC State?
32 years.
32 years. Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to do some background questions. When you were a child, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be a professional athlete or a missionary.
Okay.
Not an academic.
Yeah.
Actually, for an academic, I have a very strange background. Okay, my parents have an 8th grade education. They were immigrants from Germany. I have a family of 6 children. I'm the only one of the 6 children who actually even has a college degree out of the 6 kids.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, where I grew up in North Philadelphia was very working class. My parents sort of were laborers. My mother was a domestic. I didn't even know a college graduate. So I had no academic aspirations at all. All my parents wanted me to do was be good in school.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I'd like to get more into that. So it sounds like you obviously weren't always set on going to college. Like,
No.
Did you, obviously, so what were you considering for alternatives, and when did you begin to decide that I actually do want to go to college?
Well, actually, I was an athlete,
Okay.
and so I wanted to continue playing sports after high school. So I went to a Division III school, and I was also very religious. Okay, so I was a conservative Christian, and so I was very religious, and so my aspirations were relatively limited. Either I wanted to play sports, and that's why I went to college, or I was going to be a preacher or a minister or something like that. So actually, academics was not even. I knew no one who went to college, so it wasn't in my, even as an alternative.
And were you a basketball player? Is that
I
what it
played
was?
basketball and football in college, yeah.
Okay.
At that point, people could still play 2 sports in college.
Oh, yeah. How did you choose your major?
Another funny story, okay.
Oh, actually, I watched some of your interviews last night. I think it was about you wanted to translate the Bible into an unknown language.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to do as a Christian missionary.
And what was the thought process behind that? Did you have any specific languages that you were aware of that needed to be translated?
Well, there were lots of languages. I was with a group called the Summer Institute of Linguistics, or the Wycliffe Bible Translators, and they would go into tribes that didn't even have an orthography, and so they would first analyze the language, and then they would develop an orthography, and then they would translate the Bible. So that's why I needed linguistics as a background, and so that's why I get into it. But actually before then, I figured because I was so out of sorts in terms of college, that I was a first generation, and it was a whole new world. I had never even visited the college I went to before. I mean, so this was really sort of I figured the only thing that I would be smart enough to do would be physical ed. Nothing against physical ed. But then I took a course in physical ed and I said, oh my God, I can do more than this. And so actually I started taking languages. I took Greek and Hebrew and Latin and languages and Spanish and so forth. And actually when I was in college, I realized, oh, this is something I'm really talented at. I was a hardworking student and I was adequately bright, but I never defined myself by my brightness.
Yeah.
I was always sort of like, you're smart for an athlete. And you know what that means. You're not very smart now. But which is one reason why I love sports, and I sort of also am supportive of academics in college and so forth. So I have a special sort of warmth in my heart for athletes. So.
What did your parents and the people that you grew up with think about you going to college, considering like you were essentially the only one that you were close with that went to college?
Yeah, well, my parents thought, oh, it's nice to go to college if you want to. But they didn't really worry about it. And then actually, they couldn't correct my English because they spoke broken English, because they were from Germany and didn't come over until the 20s. And so in their 20s. So they thought it was a nice activity, but there was no push, to do it. I just sort of decided this is what I wanted to do because I didn't really have any idea what I could do other than that.
Yeah.
Because I was mostly an athlete and I loved it. And so I just did it. And then when I got to college, I was doing fine. This was, of course, before grade inflation, but I was sort of, okay, a fundamental B student. But then when I took languages, I was all of a sudden the star of the class, and it just came very easy. And then I took a linguistics course on how to analyze languages and so forth, and that was also something. And so it was something that I realized that I had a little bit of a talent in.
Yeah.
I take a sociology course and I get a B, and okay, that's fine. But I was no star or anything. But then when it came to linguistics and language, I thought, oh, here's something, and I really like doing it. It's like little puzzles and so forth. So I got psyched about it.
In the interview I watched, you mentioned, but you didn't expand on why did you end up not becoming a missionary and trying to translate an unknown language?
Yeah, actually, the organization we were going to go to, you have to get churches to support you, and so they would donate. The problem was we grew up in a German missionary church, so they gave their money to the missionaries who were German who came to the United States. So our church had no support. I married a girl from the church who was German, and so the two of us didn't have support, and I had one baby and one on the way.
Yeah.
And so I couldn't get enough money for them to even let me go because you have to reach threshold. So I needed to take a job.
Yeah.
And a former professor of mine at Wheaton College where I went, he hired me, and he always said, oh, you should be an academic, you should. And I had never thought of it. And so when I couldn't get money to go to the mission field, I decided I needed to take a job. And so he gave me a job doing research. So I did research at the Center for Applied Linguistics in Washington, D.C. for about 4 or 5 years. And I got to write a couple of books and so forth. And at that point, I seemed to be gaining, confidence and a little bit of a reputation. So I decided, well, and after 4 years, he just said, well, come work with me. And we started the first sociolinguistics program in the nation at Georgetown University. So that was my first baptism.
Did you get a master's and then a PhD?
Yes, I got a master's and then a PhD in linguistics.
And
right.
Where was those from?
I started at the University of Chicago, where I did my master's, and then I went to Hartford Seminary Foundation, which had a linguistics program, and got my PhD there. Actually, because there were a lot of religious people who were missionaries who needed linguistics background. It was something that they taught at some seminaries, and so I went there and got my PhD there.
And was that before or after Georgetown?
That was before Georgetown, yeah. So I got my PhD, and then my first teaching job was at Georgetown.
So the Hartford professor, that's where you got your bachelor's degree, right?
No, I got my bachelor's degree at Wheaton College in Illinois.
And Hartford was after you graduated from...
Never got to University of Chicago, and then I went to Hartford Seminary Foundation for my PhD. Okay. Yeah.
So how did you decide that... How did you go from having a bachelor's degree and then wanting to be a missionary, and then go to decide to get a master's degree and then decide to get a PhD?
Well, actually, the organization what I was going to was very eager to get people with graduate degrees in linguistics, because they needed them with linguistic ability in order to translate the Bible, and so they encouraged graduate study, and so they encouraged me to do graduate work, of course.
So you had, so you went into your master's and PhD still intending to be...
Yes,
okay,
yes.
To translate the Bible, okay.
As a matter of fact, one of the reasons I left the University of Chicago is because at Hartford Seminary Foundation I could take courses like in translation, and I needed a background in Hebrew and so forth. And at University of Chicago, they were more secularly oriented. But I still didn't dream of sort of academics at all.
And how did you have a challenge of being able to afford to get a master's degree or a PhD?
Well, I got married right after college. I married my high school
After your bachelor's degree?
No, yeah, after my bachelor's degree. My wife doesn't have a college degree. She's very bright and has taken courses in college and so forth, but she doesn't have a degree. But she worked at home, and so she saved up money to help us pay for our graduate studies.
That's nice to hear.
Yeah, she was very supportive.
Okay, so now I'm excited to get into your research. So one of the main things that I saw of your research that I thought was very cool was your research into the Hoi-Toiters of Ocracoke. How did you initially hear about that population?
Okay, so previous to that time, the reason I'm considered to be a pioneer in the study of sociolinguistics was that there wasn't a field at that point, and in 1967 I did a big study of Detroit African American speech. So I went to the city of Detroit and all summer interviewed people in the community there, and so we collected over 700 interviews. So that became one of the first studies on African American English.
How did that study initially start? What was the
my mentor, who was my college professor, got a grant to study it from the Office of Education, because and the reason he did that was because it was post integration, but people were pointing out sort of the difference in performance of African American students versus white students, the long-standing educational gap. And so there were concerns by the government of how language fit into that. And so we proposed a study to do that in Detroit. So one summer we went out in the field and interviewed hundreds of African Americans in Detroit. And at that point, Detroit was still sort of they were still sort of during the Great Migration, and so lots of African Americans were coming there and settling up, and that's when we sort of discovered, wow, the language of African Americans in these northern cities like Detroit, Philadelphia, New York City, and so forth, is very different from the whites. It's got Southernisms, and because of the de facto segregation, they didn't see many white people. They were in black schools and so forth, and so their language was very distinct from the whites of Detroit. So
yeah, I saw an interview where you said, which I found very interesting, that
you did your research. Good for
you. There was more difference between the white population and the black population, or there was less difference between white speech and black speech 100 years ago than there was.
That's right.
Like closer to the present, and you said that the reason was, the reason was because after the Great Migration, a lot of the housing projects essentially segregated the large, all of the incoming black people into projects where they were essentially isolated and
so actually they didn't see many white people.
Yeah.
The postmaster or the mailman or someone like that, or the guy who ran the store, and so actually it was what people don't realize is that during the Great Migration, it developed into greater de facto segregation than it existed in the South, because there were field hands and there were some whites among those and so forth. And so there was, and even today, I could play you examples of African Americans who lived on the coast of North Carolina since the 1700s, and you would say they sounded white. They don't sound that different because they lived together. They actually worked together more than people in the North. So in Philadelphia, where I grew up, we were in a segregated German neighborhood where people spoke German and so forth. We didn't have African Americans in our neighborhood. There was a band of several miles where all the African Americans lived. They didn't interact much with whites at all. They went to all black schools and so forth. And so that situation where we have the sort of really density issues, and there were, this was all sort of planned in terms of, here's where blacks live, here's where whites live. It wasn't legal, but it was normative, and so people sort of think it's strange, but there was much more segregation in the North than there was in the South. They had a society that was separate to some extent, but there was actually a lot more sort of interaction between the communities than existed here in the North, or that existed in the North. And so that was a situation that was really surprising, that African American English was becoming more distinct rather than less because of the population density. So we went into a project in Detroit. There were like six apartment buildings, 12 stories high, 8,000 people, not a white person in there.
Yeah.
It was all black people. And so in that sort of situation where they don't see, where they interact with others who are African American, it's a situation where the language keeps developing and differently from whites. So that was a very intriguing kind of situation.
Was the discovery that the dialects were becoming more distinct, was that a discovery that you and your colleague made, or was that known prior to that?
No, it was a study that came out in the after we sort of started studying these, and then looked at earlier African American English. At that point in the 60s, we did mostly studies in large urban areas that were not Southern, so Los Angeles, Philadelphia, New York City, and Detroit, were the major cities. But then when we looked at the South, we saw then when I also then did some studies in Mississippi, and I saw that some of the speech was more similar. And then when I came to North Carolina, I investigated communities like, for example, down on the coast of North Carolina, there have been blacks and whites living in the mainland together since the 1700s, early 1700s, first decade of the 1700s. They've lived isolated lives because there were no roads in there. Everything was done through the sort of rivers and canals. They live together there. They sound the same, right? Because and so when we saw that, and then saw here's what happens when they move north, they segregate, because that population on the coast of North Carolina, which was really sort of a unique community, where we have sort of 300 years of isolation and whites and blacks living together. About a third of the population was African American. We say, that's very different from the situations in the north, where in those communities everybody knows everybody. There aren't that many people. They interact. Actually, a lot of black men became worked on the water, and there was even an underground railroad that was done by the maritime industry. So they would blacks would shelter people, and they would get and they would get ships going north to take their runaway slaves to the north. So there was a component of the underground railroad that existed on the coast of North Carolina.
That reminds me of a question that I had. So, in regards to the Hoy-Toyters, it's I think it said that dialect was derived from like a dialect spoken in Britain between 1650 and 1750.
Yeah.
And also similarly, you had said that the black accent 100 years ago was more similar. So my question is, how can you tell how a dialect sounded, 300 years ago or 100 years ago if you only have writing of it?
Yeah, well, actually, sometimes writing is can be indicative of how people speak, particularly when you don't have standardized writing. So, for example, if a person, and this is true of these, if a person writes a verb third person, like he goes, if they write it without the S, which they often do if they don't speak the S, that's an indication that they had that feature. By the same token, sort of having the speech of a person who was born in sort of the late 1800s or 1900s, and we have lots of recordings of slave narratives and so forth. They're also quite indicative of what the speech is like. So, for example, in Ocracoke, we have the speech of a person who came there in our family, as the only black family in the island of Ocracoke, who came there in 1865, right at the close of the Civil War. They were the only black family that lived in Ocracoke since that time. When we got there in 1990, there was a woman who was in her early 90s, and we started interviewing her. So she was born in 1904, and she lived to be 104.
Wow.
And so sort of that gives us an indication of what their speech was like when they came there.
Yeah, I think that's so awesome how there's like living historical artifacts,
That's right.
So cool.
And that's why when we go into a community, we interview people as old as we can get.
Yeah.
100 years old, we don't get, and actually, since we can sort of, you don't even have to speak, you don't even have to be coherent speaking. If you just talk, we can get an idea. So, where we go to get these folks, we go to old folks' homes. Yeah. Right. So we go down to we go down to Hyde County, just this isolated county, and say, okay, let's go to the old folks' home. Well, we're not sure that person, they have a little dementia, but if they can talk, we can use that. They don't have to make sense.
That's funny. Let's see.
So that's because recorded language is always much more useful than written language. We can work with it, but there are lots of caveats that you have to deal with.
So I saw that you said in an interview that North Carolina has the richest linguistic heritage and I think variation.
Yeah.
Do you really believe this? And why do you think that's the case? Because I think like a state like Virginia would be very similar geographically, and maybe like a state like Texas would be more diverse geographically.
Yeah. Well, to a certain extent, I say this as a used car salesman. It sounds good, but then when you think about North Carolina, okay, first of all, we have mountains. North Carolina is the most demographically sort of peculiar state east of the Mississippi River. So we have mountains, and we have the Scots-Irish who came in through Philadelphia and went out to Pittsburgh and then down along the Great Wagons Trail. So they settled Appalachian. And then we have the coast where we had people who settled in Virginia and then went down the coast by water. So for example, there are islands in Virginia that sound a lot like the islands of the Outer Banks, because that's where the people came from. And then we had the fusion of African Americans who came both from Virginia and up from Charleston. And then we have like the Lumbee Indians, who are really distinctive. And now we have Hispanicized English. So actually sort of, because it's the most diverse topography, and the migratory routes were different, and North Carolina was set up to be a state with sort of small towns, not the big towns that eventually developed.
Yeah. So
it was set up as small communities. So there was lots and lots of diversity, from the coast to the mountains, in a sense. So there's a sense in which, who's counting?
Yeah.
But
we definitely are. We are definitely towards the top of the list.
We're definitely towards the top of the list.
Maybe at the top, but who's counting?
Who's counting? Right? And it's interesting because nobody's really argued that point. But think about it. So the guys get on TV and they say, "We have the largest used cars inventory of anybody in the United States," and nobody's getting up and saying, "No, you don't." So I'm a little bit of a used car salesman.
Yeah. How do you find out about like isolated groups like the Hoyt-Toyoters or the isolated groups in the Appalachians?
Like the Lumbee, yeah.
By virtue of like they have the accent because they're isolated, so they. In that way, they're kind of hard to find. It would seem.
Yeah. So actually, when I came to North Carolina in 1991 or 92, we didn't know anybody here. They just sort of invited me, cold call, because of they had heard about me, and so they invited me. So we didn't have friends. So my wife and I came. Our kids were pretty much raised by that point, and they didn't join us. So we didn't have any friends. And so every weekend we'd pick a different site to go to. So we'd go to Edenton, and then we'd go out west somewhere that just sort of, and we get a bed and breakfast and then sort of ride around and talk to people and casual conversations.
That's cool. So it was kind of like a mix between work and pleasure where you were kind of...
Yeah, well, we were trying to explore the state, but we also didn't have any friends. So it's not like we had a social to go to Saturday night. So we sort of explored the city. And then one of my guys here said, "Oh, you ought to go to Ocracoke. They speak Shakespearean English there." Well, Of course they don't, but I said, well, if people keep talking about this island, we should go there. So we just went and visited, and and I was in class, and I said, "Anybody know anybody from Ocracoke here?" And a student said, "My mother went to school with a person from Ocracoke." I said, "Well, what was her name? Do you remember?" So I called her, and as it turned out, she had gone to high school and college here and gone back to Ocracoke and was a big leader in the community. And said, well, would you mind if we tell her that we know you and could talk to her? She said, sure. So so it's just sort of word of mouth. And then sort of once you're there, it's sort of like, okay, can you sell yourself?
Yeah.
Can you sort of relate to these people? And that's one of the dimensions of my background, is because I don't come from an educated, exclusive family, because I was sort of born in a working class neighborhood. I really relate well to working class people. I kind of, in some ways, prefer them to middle class people. No, I don't prefer their politics, but so I'm very comfortable. And islands like this, like, they don't care what kind of degrees you have. I mean, are you nice to them? Are you funny? Like Ocracoke likes humor, and so so if you relate to them on that level, they like you, and so they don't care. You don't come in and say, I got a PhD in this stuff. That's a turnoff. But if you can interact with them and play poker with them or stuff like that, so that's what we did, and that really helps, and it's true. And it's true of lots of working class communities. The onus is on you to present yourself as a person that they don't mind interacting with, and drinking a beer, or going to church with, or whatever.
So now I'd like to shift a little bit. So this is more, I guess, the philosophical perspectives on linguistics. So I'll start off with like an anecdote that really stuck with me. So my dad is from Southwest Louisiana.
Okay.
And
South Louisiana has a lot of linguistic diversity too.
Yeah, exactly. And he said that when his grandparents were in elementary school, there was like French Cajun kids that would go to the elementary school, and if they were caught speaking French in the school, then they would be like beaten. And they so essentially, like, the French language is pretty much dead there.
Yeah.
Or at least the French, like, Creole language is pretty much dead there. Yeah. And I think that's something that's so sad to me, because I haven't really sat down to really formalize my thoughts on it, but I always prefer, like, more differences, more diversity. I think that's so much more interesting of a world to live in, where people are different from you. That's like one of the main reasons I like to travel, is so that you see something that you don't see every day.
That's right.
And so I guess one of my questions is, like, actually I wrote down a specific question. So, should we teach proper pronunciation and grammar?
That's a complicated question, and it's complicated because of how we view differences. See, I have no problem with people teaching what we call standardized English for whatever the purpose is. The problem is that when we start teaching that, that's considered to be proper, right, and correct.
Yeah.
And the reason it's proper, right, and correct is because of who speaks it, not because of the language. All of these languages have dialects. So here's my approach. My approach is to try to get people to celebrate language diversity. So we go to the state fair every year. We give away 7,000 buttons and so forth. You can have buttons. And so we do documentaries on all of these dialects on PBS and so forth. We've done 18, won a couple of Emmys and so forth. And the whole idea was, when I came to North Carolina, one of the things I realized about North Carolina is that it's a state that loves itself. So they do. They love the sort of diversity from the mountains to the ocean, and they also love the fact that they have these musicians, James Taylor, people like that, and they have these poets, and they have these writers, and they have these artists and performers. And so what I thought was, but what about their language? Let's see if we can get them to celebrate their language, because it's so diverse and it's so neat. And it's really going to be sad when people can't hear the Hoy-Toyers talk like that anymore, or the Lumbee Indians who have a distinct dialect and so forth. So what I try to do is celebrate the dialect, try to not talk about standardized English so much as it's English for particular kinds of purposes. Yeah, if you want to be an academic, you got to talk that way, all right? And that's how you're expected to write when you're doing a business world. But if you're an athlete, there's a whole genre of sort of listening to a sportscast that is very different from this. And so rather than think of it as right and wrong, I think of it different purposes. Mm-hmm. So the grammar that we are taught by our freshmen, as a freshman here, it's not about right grammar versus wrong grammar. It's about grammar for more academic purposes. And by emphasizing that, you can still celebrate. And so actually one of the things we do here, we have a group called Linguistic Diversity Ambassadors. And what these students do is they go to freshman writing classes and talk about all the dialects of North Carolina and some of the patterns and rules and so forth, to instill this sort of pride and celebration of diversity, just as we celebrate sort of the great musicians who have distinct styles and so forth. So our whole focus is on celebrating and enjoying, as opposed to being caught up in right and wrong. So it's so there's while it seems pretty simple, it's really sort of heavily ideological.
Yeah.
So we don't use terms like correct, proper, and so forth, because hey, if blacks were in charge of our, that would be the standard. Because there's plenty of evidence that it's the people who sort of are the socially sort of privileged who make language a part of them, and then they become the rules for language use. So we do sort of, there is an underlying sort of ideological message that really drives what I do in terms of what I teach.
Yeah, I realized when I had wrote that question, I had put proper in quotation marks.
Good for you.
I didn't know. I forgot to say that.
No, you know how to say it. I'm just saying, and that's one of the reasons I teach a class for graduate students. I get 40 students in a graduate class, because I don't want to turn anybody down for the opportunity to learn that.
Yeah.
And to celebrate, because it's so cool.
Another question I have, which is similar along the same lines. So most linguistic diversity comes from isolation, and as we become a more, ever-connected world, there's less isolation, like vastly less isolation than there was like 100 years ago. Opinions on that as well? Isolation, the lack of isolation will certainly bring about less linguistic diversity. Do you have any opinions on that?
Yeah. Well, that's true. And the reason Ocracoke, for example, is losing its historical brogue is because less than half the people who live there now are islanders.
Yeah. Because
people have houses there and they come in and so forth, and that's what happens. By the same token, though, we're not. So small islands are particularly sort of problematic in terms of maintaining it. But there are new dialects at the same time. So when I first started the study, people never talked about a California dialect. But now they're talking about a California dialect, and they mimic it on one of the California girls and stuff like that, where they have, where they have this sort of a raspy voice, and their sentences go up at the end rather than down. So there are lots of things. So while we're losing dialects like those in Ocracoke, and to some extent Appalachian, so forth, there are new dialects in Northern California. There are new dialects, like there's a Seattle dialect now, there's a Portland dialect, and it used to be there weren't any of these sort of dialects. So they're shifting. And you're right that small dialect areas that were formed because of isolation or maintained before isolation are certainly endangered now.
Do you think that there should be like any policies in place that could help, like, I don't know, preserve that?
Well, actually, that's what we do. So for example, when we have a website that has over 3,500 interviews that we've done here in North Carolina. And so we've done about 130 interviews on Ocracoke. All of those are preserved on the website. They have old people, middle-aged people, and young people, so I often get requests from people, my grandfather died and I just wanted to hear how he sounded, could you send us a file of the interview you did with him, and we'll do that and so forth. So we can't change it. We can't change the fact, because that's a sort of community thing. Do you want to talk like that still? And there are pockets of people, who really embrace it, who use it. But for the most part, that's a community's decision. But we also want the community to know that this is something we want to celebrate. And actually, what we found, because we teach 8th graders every year for 30 years, we go in and have a whole week with social studies when they study the history of North Carolina, about the dialects of North Carolina. And that's really changed the attitudes of the people. Now they really think their dialect is cool, even though
that's awesome to hear.
Because they marry outsiders, at least in their second marriages. That does change things. By the same token, because one of the questions we get is, well, does media and social media make a difference? Yeah, it makes a difference. But for the most part, people want to speak like people they interact with, Like, you don't interact with the newscaster, talk back to him. You might yell at him, but you don't want to model him.
Yeah, I think, it is, speaking of like sort of new dialects, there's a lot of like new slang and like really weird stuff coming out of TikTok. I'm not sure.
I know, yeah.
I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but it's become kind of a joke recently about how much like goofy stuff.
Goofy stuff, and then because it's anonymous, some of the stuff. This is for my students to do. That's what they like doing. That we have a site on TikTok, and they put stuff up there and so forth. And there's a whole issue of commodification, where because it can be anonymous, whites can try to sound black and so forth. So there are a lot of issues about that. But pretty much it's you can detect these sorts of things. Yeah. So you're a little young for this, but anyhow, the night O.J. Simpson, there was a Friday night where he was in a van, and he was driving around, and the cameras were following him and so forth. And the news was, O.J. Simpson is in a car now, and what's going to happen? And a guy got on TV, he said, we're just talking to someone who can see O.J. in the car, and I'm going to put him on, and so he says, so what does O.J. look like? And he says, he'd be scared. And I said to my wife, that's not a black person. That's a white person trying to sound bad. First of all, he wouldn't say he'd be scared, because that's used for habitual activity by blacks. Whites don't know that, so they just use it as a substitute for he is, But so you can, so a trained ear can hear the commodification. But it is an issue where whites can take on black speech, and use some of the terms and so forth. I realize that, and that does have an effect, on slang to a certain extent. I'm actually on a board now for the Oxford English Dictionary, the sort of world's dictionary of English, where we're doing a dictionary of African American language.
Oh, that's cool.
So, historical, which looks up first uses and stuff like that, just like you would use the Oxford English Dictionary.
Wow. So just to close out, maybe give, so that way we can help, maybe the people that are listening to this. If you had to give some advice to a student that's considering getting either a master's degree or a PhD and becoming a professor, what pieces of advice would you give to them?
General professor?
Yeah, any kind of professor.
My advice to people who want to become professors is that you better be a lifelong learner. Mm-hmm. It's not taking what you learn as a graduate student. There was no discipline that I helped start at the time.
Yeah. And
one of the things you realize is that educating students is a lifelong matter. And so I'm 83 years old, so I was doing this before computers. My first 4 books were written on a typewriter. Wow. We didn't have word processors. Yeah. So if you think that what you learn as a student is going to be sufficient to teach, you better think it's something else, because everything is different. I got my first computer in 1984, Mm-hmm. I had never used a computer before. And so if I hadn't learned that, and some people say, well, I have my knowledge, No, you don't. There's so much. Imagine all of the things that didn't exist when I first started teaching,
Yeah.
So, but by the same token, as you get older, the continual learning helps your mind.
Yeah.
And I love learning new stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and so in a sense, if you love to learn, it's a great profession. If you think you're an expert and just spew knowledge that you learned in graduate school, good luck. You'll be done in 10. So the fact that I can learn new stuff all the time, and that my students teach me things. Like when I came out, I never thought that I'd be producing documentaries. All of our first initial documentaries were analog, and now they're all digital. And I have documentarians. I don't do documentaries, but I have a topic I'm interested in. I raise money to do it, and I can get somebody to do it. So the other thing about continual learning is academics need to be more entrepreneurial and think of what hasn't been done and that you can do. Yeah. To help education, So just teaching your old college notes ain't going to do it. Yeah. And so now, when I first taught, there was no PowerPoint. There wasn't even Xeroxing. Right. You just got up and talked. Yeah. You can't do that anymore. If you don't have something from TikTok, from Facebook, and from all the social media, and if you don't have visuals for them to interact with, and if you can't do sexy PowerPoints and so forth, because you're fighting for kids' attention. Yeah. And the third aspect of that's really interesting is it's not so much about facts anymore. Because I can say something and not be sure and say, look that up. And anybody in the class with a phone can look up and see if I'm telling the truth or not. Look up and see if that's the year that happened, or something like that. Yeah. So you can't get away because you're the expert, and there's lots of knowledge you don't have. Yeah. And so in that sense, sort of working more collaboratively with students, lots of students are smarter than me, let them be smart to help me. So I really, my approach to learning and teaching is much more entrepreneurial. None of my kids ever took a linguistics course. I have 4 kids, but 3 of them are venture capitalists.
That's interesting.
And are extremely entrepreneurial, and they're making it because as my one son says, who owns a venture capital system, he says, anybody can crunch the numbers. You got to get out there and be creative and be able to talk and write and sell what you're doing. So there's a sense in which I think that's also true of education. If you teach in a sort of low interest area, like how many people are interested in linguistics, you got to sell it, man.
Yeah,
you got to tell them why it's important and why it's cool and why they need to know about it and why they'll be better off for the rest of their life having this approach to language differences. So I'm very sort of into sort of being entrepreneurial as an educator and not limited by the way things are supposed to be.
Thank you for that. I really enjoyed the interview. And
if you have any other questions, or if you have any follow-up that you want to, just email me and I'll give you the time that you need. Because as you can tell, I'm here at 83.
Yeah.
Not because I need the money.
Yeah.
I'm here because I love what I do. I love hanging out with young people because that way your colleagues don't die. Right? Most people who are most people who are 83, these are conversations. What doctor did you go to today? And which of my friends died? Right? I get to hang out with kids who are, talking about stuff that's happening in the real world, what they're going to do with their life, who they're in love with and all that sort of stuff. That's really fun.
Well, thank you.